There we go. Good morning, everybody. Many thanks for joining us this morning. We'll look to start in the next couple of seconds. We'll just give it 10 more seconds or so, just let a few people join, and then we'll look to kick off. Perfect. There we go. Right, well, we'll look to kick off. So yes, as I said, good morning, everybody. Many thanks for joining us this morning, and welcome to Camwood's Crash Course covering Are You Getting the Most Out of Microsoft 365? My name is James Churchill. I'm Camwood's Head of Sales, and joining me this morning is Camwood's Head of Technology, Daniel Williams. And over the next 45 minutes or so, the two of us will look to cover off all things Microsoft 365, but concentrating specifically on the benefits and gains that can be realized from the suite of services. And as you can see here from the agenda, we'll start off with just a quick introduction into Microsoft 365 before touching on some misconceptions and some challenges. And then Dan will look to talk about Microsoft 365 data and data insights, talking through the usage of data and the types of data that Microsoft 365 can hold within your organization and about your organization, but importantly about data insights and how you can use the data insights built in to the suite of services to gain real business value. We'll then touch on a couple of quick wins for you straight out of the box to get you going with Microsoft 365 before talking through a couple of Microsoft customer case studies. And then finally, we'll touch on Camwood's suite of services for Microsoft 365, which we've been deploying into our customer base and working with our customers to realize some real value and benefit from those suite of services. And we'll, of course, we'll make sure there's some time at the end for some questions. And on that point, if you do have any questions at all during this presentation, please do feel free to ask. Just drop it into the comments box on the right there, and we'll pick that up. And do remember, everybody who's joined this morning is entitled to a one-to-one consultation with Dan. So we'll be in touch with you after the event to find a suitable date and time for that chat. So with that, I'll pass over to Dan now, who will start off with the introduction to Microsoft 365. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, James. And good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for attending. So as James sort of alluded to, we're going to sort of kick through the presentation and sort of the discussion points as a whole. But the obvious place is really to start around sort of what is Microsoft 365. So the majority, if not all people on the call, really should understand what Microsoft 365 is from a solution stack point of view. However, I thought it'd be a really good sort of introductory point to ultimately just have a deep dive through it from an initial point, from an initial overview, really. So those of you familiar with sort of Office 365 and Microsoft 365 from sort of two different types of solutions and two different types of SKUs, Microsoft went through a bit of an exercise probably the last 2 years to migrate and transition the existing Office 365 SKUs and product sets into Microsoft 365. So when you think of Office 365, you think of, Exchange Online, Microsoft Teams, and everything that good comes with it as well. What Microsoft have done is rebrand and rebadge Microsoft 365 to include some of the more premium features that were associated with Office 365. So in Office 365 world, you would have had to buy additional licenses for security, EMS pieces, premium Azure Active Directory. Now with Microsoft 365, they've been able to pull all of that together into a single SKU, which is very easy to consume and understand. And ultimately, you will have the ability to consume everything that you're sort of seeing on the page here as well. So things like SharePoint Online for your data, Microsoft Teams for collaboration, Azure Active Directory for identity, Intune and Endpoint Manager for endpoint management and analytics associated to it, and then everything else you would expect from an full Office suite as well, so Word, Excel, etc. The only thing that's not actually present on this slide is the Microsoft Power Platform. So utilizing the Microsoft 365 license and SKU actually enables you to start leveraging things like Power BI, Power Apps, Power Automate, and virtual chat agents as well, if you're going down that chatbot route as well. So it's more of an introduction, sort of an overview in terms of what they've done from Office 365 to transition to Microsoft 365, and ultimately what you've got available out of the box as well. So I also thought there'd be a really good opportunity to talk around sort of what Microsoft are doing through enabling organizations for digital transformation. So Microsoft have these sort of 8 pillars that you're seeing on the screen at the moment. So on the right-hand side is everything that Microsoft are trying to do from a solution point of view to help organizations change the way they're doing things. So empowering your employees to be more innovative, make sure they've got more use of their time, working smarter and working better, driving culture change throughout the organization. And that's ultimately everything that's been done through modern workplace. Engaging customers better, so utilizing things like Dynamics 365 and the data sets that surround that as well. Optimizing operations teams into more high velocity and agile operations team rather than the traditional sort of ITIL methodology that most organizations are used to right now. And then transforming your products ultimately into what they were, legacy, maybe they're on premises, maybe you're providing sort of software as a service, etc. And then transitioning that into something like around like a serverless function or potentially containerization as well. So on the left-hand side, ultimately, this is how Microsoft are doing it. So modern workplace, enabling your employees and your staff members to do more with their time and utilizing the data and AI analytics that are built into more advanced product sets within the Microsoft Azure platform as well. Business applications, Dynamics 365, we talked about that. And the applications and infrastructure. So if you were to transition from a traditional on-prem into public cloud, utilizing Microsoft Azure, this is how Microsoft are helping organizations move into a digital transformation format. So when we're talking about sort of the misconceptions and challenges that we see sort of across the board and within the marketplace, within Microsoft 365, it's really been sort of more apparent and very much front and center in the last sort of 2 years. Especially when we're talking about the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as the mandate for remote workers and everyone working from home. So typically sort of two organizations go through 2 different types of approaches. They either extend what they've already got from an on-premises point of view for their existing remote workers, and that might take the form of expanding their VDI solution, enhancing the VPN connectivity to the end users, but they're still potentially going to be dragging all the problems that they had with them in their existing on-premises into a remote working world, and that's not really sort of beneficial, and that's not how remote work should be utilized and undertaken from an organizational perspective. The other piece is really around organizations that have seen the remote working piece as a bit of a challenge, and they didn't have anything really in place to support that. So what they went ahead and did is provision Microsoft or Office 365 to support the remote workers, but they've done it in a very sort of rushed, bad practice sort of manner. So what we've seen within the marketplace and the overall sort of organizational structure throughout all of our customer bases is they've turned Microsoft 365 on to enable Microsoft Teams, enable SharePoint Online to expand their remote working capabilities. Now, Microsoft do a fantastic job of making all these solutions, technology stacks available to people straight away, but there's a lot more work behind the scenes to ensure that you're working in a very secure manner, making sure you're working in a compliant manner, and ensuring that you've got governance wrapped around the entire platform as well. So it's one thing to take it out of the box and start utilizing it, but unless you've got the right controls in place, it can go very, very badly for you. And that's what we're doing with a lot of organizations certainly now, is helping them retrofit what they've already done around best practice and securing their environment as best they can. So from a Microsoft 365 data point, again, Microsoft do a fantastic job of collecting lots of data in terms of how organizations are utilizing, Microsoft Teams, Exchange Online, SharePoint, and ultimately how people are collaborating with each other as a whole. Now, what we do with a lot of organizations from a data perspective is actually bring that data forward for you. So Microsoft, like I said, do a great job at collecting the data, but they don't always do a fantastic job of shouting about where this data actually sits. And I've pulled out a couple of examples and a couple of points. I think probably one of the more pertinent ones is the usage data. And this is something we actually run into quite a lot when we talk to customers on a regular basis. So a lot of the times when people engage with different organizations and customers, they will have a blanket SKU model. So for example, an organization may have E5 across the board, but understanding whether or not each individual user actually needs to use that full-blown license SKU is another matter entirely. And this is where the usage data really sort of comes into play. So you get a detailed understanding within your Office 365 or your Microsoft 360 environment, who's using what applications, how are they using, what's the collaboration like, how long are they spending in meetings, are they improving how they're working on a day-to-day basis. So to give you an example of a customer we worked with quite recently, 5,000 seats, they were utilizing Microsoft 365 across the board for remote working. But actually it turned out once we turned on the usage data and monitored it for a period of time, 20% of their user base didn't need to use the full-blown license SKU that they were actually consuming. And the reason for that was a lot of these users were actually only using Office Online versus the full fat Office suite you would install locally on a laptop or a desktop. So looking at that usage data and the analytics behind it, we were able to recommend and propose an approach to allow that business to change the license SKU almost immediately to a lower end license SKU, a much cheaper license SKU, and ultimately claw expenses back into the business. So it's this sort of usage data is a good starting point around data metrics within Microsoft 365, and it's a really sort of powerful tool set that a lot of organizations don't fully utilize and understand. So the other piece I wanted to pick out was something called My Analytics. Now this has been around probably 3 or 4 years, and it had a bit of a brush in terms of what people were used to. They didn't like the whole Big Brother approach in terms of people watching and capturing data on how they were spending their working days. And that's not what My Analytics is all about. My Analytics is ultimately is enabling organizations to capture how employees are spending their time and enabling them to make better decisions based on data. And when I talk about data, it's ultimately around how are they collaborating with other employees within the business? How long are they spending in meetings? Are they putting enough focus time to actually complete critical business tasks on a regular basis? Because if you're anything like me, I sit in meeting after meeting after meeting after meeting, and there's no time in between. So it can be really difficult to build out specific focus time. So what My Analytics does is actually identify gaps in that person's diary to say, okay, well, you've got a gap between 10 and 12. You should really set that aside for pure focus and not worry about anything else. On top of that, it's actually sort of more front and center than it's ever been is really mental health. So it was a bit of a taboo before the remote working mandate and the COVID-19 pandemic to talk about mental health. But now Microsoft are bringing it to the forefront by utilizing something like My Analytics to identify the well-being and the focus time of employees within the organization, so they're not getting completely drained out and ultimately hitting a burnout period through that life cycle. So through the data analytics, what I'm trying to get across is Microsoft do a fantastic job of capturing it. It's really down to organizations, and it's down to you to start pulling that data out and analyzing how you're using it. And one way you can use this data is through the Data Insights platform and feature set that Microsoft make available throughout Microsoft 365. So there's a number of different modules that are available as part of it. And again, like I said, Microsoft make the data available, but it's really difficult to sort of navigate your way through and ensure that you're actually looking at the right screens and actually capturing the right data. So what Microsoft do is they focus on sort of several key different things that I'll focus on in the next couple of slides. Things like productivity, security, compliance, to give you a few examples. And it encapsulates what the platform looks from a top to bottom point of view, focusing on individual users and individual devices, all the way up to your data architecture level and your high level platform layer. And they utilize things like scoring metrics. So it may be a score out of 5,000, it may be a score out of 100%. And what you will be able to encapsulate and analyze is where you are in that journey in terms of topping up your scores. So an example might be you may be at 20% right now, and it will give you insights to go ahead and improve your score to bring you up to the industry standard and align yourselves to best practice as well. So the first one I really wanted to talk about is productivity, and it's something that pretty much gets ignored a lot of the time because ultimately organizations, they're focused on security, they're focused on compliance, and they're focused on throughput. Now, productivity is actually a major part of how people are spending their time. And we talk about productivity, we talk about communication, we talk about meeting times, we talk about content collaboration, and actual specific what's going on in the endpoints itself. And if I focus on the endpoint analytics itself, Microsoft have enabled the feature set to understand what's going on with an individual device. So by default, Microsoft come out and say a user should be able to be productive within 30 seconds of pressing that power on button and be able to start completing tasks straight away. And you can start analyzing to understand, okay, this particular device is having a slow boot time, and you can dive a little bit deeper and understand why is that happening. Maybe you've got applications that are consistently crashing. Maybe you've got group policies that are in place that's slowing down log on time and boot up time, ultimately affecting productivity and the end user experience. And again, as I was talking about the metric scores that Microsoft 365 make available, you can see at the top right there, this particular organization has a score of 63%. They're above the industry standard, but they're behind on the peer benchmark. So from an organizational point of view, this particular example, they've got a lot more work to do to bring themselves up to industry standard. And when we talk about compliance, I appreciate there's probably quite a lot of compliance conscious organizations on the call today. So it's actually something that does get missed out quite a lot. And when I talk about compliance as a whole, we're really talking about the data architecture and how you're capturing information that goes through the Microsoft 365 platform. So whether it's SharePoint Online or Exchange Online or any encapsulation of data points, and that's all captured and measured within here. So there may be technical actions that are coming out of it, non-technical actions, and on-demand compliance audits. For example, an organization may be going through a GDPR assessment and ensuring that you've got all the right metrics and controls in place to ensure that you've got data classification in place, you've got data lifecycle management in place as well, and ultimately ensuring that you're hitting and meeting all the compliance requirements as you go through this process. And the final one, sort of my favorite really, is around the Microsoft 365 data insights for security. Now, when we talk about security, we're really focusing on sort of two things. We're talking about identity, and we are talking about sort of the environmental security as a whole. So you can see in the top right there, we're really sort of focusing around what the secure score of the environment is. And that might be something like multi-factor authentication. Has that been turned on for all the administrators? Has it been turned on for all your users? How have you secured your endpoints? Have you got endpoint for Defender enabled? Have you got endpoint for identity enabled? And ultimately just getting a clear understanding of what that security model looks from a top to bottom point of view. And the same thing sort of is also on the identity side of things, using compliance access policies, conditional access policies to ensure that users that are logging into your environment are who they say they are. Analyzing risky sign-ins, and all of this data can be sucked out and analyzed either within the portal itself, or ultimately you can use something like Azure Sentinel as a scene tool to feed all these data analytics into and get a clear understanding of what it looks like top to bottom. Now, because we've talked about the metric scores and because we've talked about the actionable insights that you can go ahead, I thought it would be a good idea to talk about how an organization can pick up some really obvious and quick wins, and sort of calling back to the previous point around some of the challenges we've seen with organizations that have moved to Office 365 and Microsoft 365 is ultimately everything around the actionable insights associated to it. So here is a really good example of Secure Score. And if you see at the bottom box that's highlighted there, you can see some actionable insights that are quite easy to go ahead and start enabling to start pulling up your Secure Score summary score to bring you in line with benchmarks and industry standards. So enabling multi-factor authentication for global admins might seem a really obvious thing to do, but again, a lot of organizations don't do that, and it's actually a really quick win. Turning on multi-factor authentication for all your users. Okay, slightly more complex, but again, it's something that actually requires quite low effort to start enabling and start getting your users to start consuming it. Data auditing, spam policies, everything that's part and parcel with the Microsoft 365 platform is ultimately presented in this format to enable organizations to start turning features and functionality on within the platform on an ongoing and a regular basis. And I thought it'd be a good idea to talk about a couple of customer case studies that organizations have worked with Microsoft and other partners on, and I've pulled out sort of two relatively large organizations that have done some really good stuff within the Microsoft 365 platform. So the first one, Rotherham NHS Foundation Trust, probably one of the more forward-thinking trusts out there in the UK at the moment. So probably about 3 or 4 years ago, they started utilizing Microsoft 365 and more specifically Microsoft Teams to improve the collaboration and communication throughout the entire platform. So they made a decision to, in true sort of public sector fashion, to make the most out of their investment within the platform itself. So they took the opportunity to understand what they're currently doing at the moment in on-premises legacy world and how they can transition into Microsoft 365 and actually start utilizing some of the more beneficial features. And the first point ultimately is around their analytics. So they had an existing analytics platform that was quite legacy. It didn't really work with the amount of data and throughput that was coming through, resulting to the COVID-19 pandemic, because there were more test results coming through, there were more patients coming through the door, and their existing platform just couldn't keep up with it. So utilizing the Power BI platform, they were actually able to transpose their existing analytics and data sets into Power BI to give a more fully featured and functional version of an analytical platform to get a much better understanding of what the data visualization within the platform looked like. The SMS integration and COVID-19 test scheduling, they had a mandate from an organizational level to improve the end-to-end service that they were offering to doctors, clinicians, as well as patients. So they ultimately utilize a number of different services, all driven through Microsoft Teams, but ultimately leveraging the Power Platform to start automating some of those flows. So to give you an example, a patient would check in, submit a test result, that would then power through the Power Automate platform and then notify clinicians, doctors, as well as the end patients around their test results. So ultimately improving the data that they're releasing out to end clients or patients and doctors, etc., tenfold from that perspective. And ultimately what they wanted to do is improve the overall telehealth solution that they had in place. And they've done that through utilizing Microsoft Teams, Microsoft 365, and ultimately the Power Platform as well. The Drax Group is another one that's quite an interesting organization. So if anyone from up north is on the call, you probably do know them. They're one of the major electricity providers in the UK, especially from up north. But they spent a lot of money in terms of multiple different solutions that were based around their security environment as a whole. So they had different solutions for antivirus, different solutions for email security, different solutions for endpoint management. And what they were able to do is ultimately stand next to Microsoft 365 and leverage the investment they'd already made within Microsoft 365 to rip and replace what they already had in place and replace it with the Microsoft 365 security solutions that were available to them. So enabling things like spam filtering and phishing attack filtering associated to their Exchange Online environment, replacing their antivirus they had in place with Endpoint for Defender, replacing their identity security solutions with Endpoint for Identity. So instead of using multiple disjointed solutions, they were able to bring everything together from a security standpoint end to end, and ultimately reduce the amount of expenditure by millions pretty much overnight by turning these solutions on. So I suppose the key thing from the Drax Group is make use of the investment that you've made within Microsoft 365. Look at the solutions that are available out of the box from a security, from a compliance, from a collaboration point of view, and pull everything together to ensure that you're getting the most bang for your buck associated to the solution. And what I just wanted to finish up on and sort of tie up together is ultimately what we are doing from an organizational level associated to Microsoft 365 services. So we are not sort of a traditional sort of managed service provider or a cloud solution partner. In that respect, and by the way, this isn't a sales pitch at all by any stretch of the imagination. It's really just identifying what we're doing with organizations and customers. So we are a data-driven and an analytical organization and partner organization that works with customers to ensure they're getting the most out of their environments as a whole. And the way we do that is ultimately everything that you see on screen, but it's really focused down on the advisory services that you're seeing in the bottom right. So from an organizational and a customer perspective, we will onboard you into our service model. We will take a view and a snapshot of, okay, you are not quite at industry standard yet. You're in foundational, you've set up Office Microsoft 365 and you're doing some good stuff. But to ensure that you're getting to the industry standard, we need to do X, Y, and Z. And it's our job within the service model to work with an organization and work with the customer to ensure we're dragging their metric scores up that I showed you earlier to the industry standard so we can get you in a very standardized approach. Once we've hit that standardized approach, it's now our job and our model, our service model, to push you more into the advanced tier to get you close to as 100% or get you into the high point scenario that we discussed earlier as well. And the way we do this is we leverage CIS benchmarks and National Cyber Security Central benchmarks to ultimately align the best practices aligned to your environment and ensure you're driving that score up and ensuring you're making the most out of the platform. Now that's all well and good, ensuring everything's built out to best practices, but it's really important to ensure that you're taking the customer requirements through that process. So you may have a financial services organization, you may have a healthcare organization that needs to have specific requirements built into this transition roadmap. And that's ultimately what we do from an end-to-end perspective whenever we drag customers through this journey and ultimately help them enable more and more out of the Microsoft 365 platform. So I just wanted to sort of end there and just say thank you very much, everyone. Really enjoyed talking about the Microsoft 365 platform as a whole. My contact details are there if you wanted to reach out specifically, but what I will do is hand over to James for any other Q&A and sort of just to tie up the session. So thank you very much.
No, that's perfect. Thank you. That was really, really interesting. So really appreciate your time there. And whilst you're chatting, we've actually we've received a few questions, and just looking how much time we've got left, we've got just over 5 minutes, so should be able to cover these off perfectly. I'll fire these questions to you if that's okay. Let me find the one I think is going to be the trickiest for you to answer. Okay, here we go. Where is it best to start with M365?
That's quite an open question. There's no real sort of correct answer in terms of where you should start. I think the important thing to do is to understand what you want to get out of the platform. So do you want to turn on hybrid identity models? Do you want to turn on better security posture across the estate? Do you want to move your existing mail architecture into Microsoft 365? So the best way to get started in Microsoft 365 is really down to you, and it's really down to what you want to get out of the platform. So initially, you need to understand your requirements as a business. Maybe you're turning off your data center and you need to move everything to 365. That's great. You need to analyze what you've got on premises and what you need to transition. And that can take form of, like I said, moving mail architecture across. Maybe you need to analyze your group policies to transition those into Intune and Endpoint Manager, but it's really down to your specific requirements. So take stock of what you've got, understand your requirements, and then match that up against the Microsoft 365 solution stack.
That makes sense. So I guess you're saying the time spent at the beginning, you can never not spend enough time. That give considerations both from a commercial aspect. You may need to exit data centers. There may be upcoming renewal dates with some infrastructure sooner than others. So it really is spending as much time as possible around that table as a business unit with different departments in that business to find the right path to Microsoft 365.
Yeah, and there's multiple transition plans that you can leverage and utilize. By we can't stress enough how much preparation time needs to be built into it. It's all well and good throwing up the connectivity and start enabling Microsoft 365, but like I said at the beginning, the challenges we saw with the remote working model was organizations were just turning it on without any sort of thought and process. They were just trying to fit a need and put a sticker over a wound. So what you need to do, certainly as we're now coming closer to Freedom Day and everyone's going back into the office, is to start making use of the time that you've got to prepare and understand what your environment looks like and what that transition needs to look like as well.
Perfect, makes sense. And then another question we've got here, which is a really good question, because again, I mean, I find, and I know you do in your experience as well, it sometimes isn't considered at the beginning, and it's an afterthought that can cause a problem if not tackled early. From a licensing aspect, what type of licensing would you need to start that transition journey?
Again, it sort of really varies, and it depends on what you're trying to get out of it. So Microsoft make a number of different SKUs available, and working through the Microsoft 365 licensing model is almost a job amongst itself. And it also depends on how many users you've got in the environment. So if you're a sub 300 user environment, you could look to leverage Microsoft 365 Business Premium, for example, to leverage all the core and key functionality within Microsoft 365, as well as some of the more enhanced security features to start enabling the platform as a whole. Now, if you're an enterprise or an SME organization, then you could start looking to leverage things like Microsoft 365 E3 or E5, depending on what type of solution and feature sets that you needed to get out of the environment as a whole. So, to give you an example, E5 comes with the Teams voice licensing built into it, and E3 doesn't. E5 comes with a lot more compliance and enhanced security features. E3 gives you lots out of the box, but it doesn't give you those enhanced features associated to it. So again, it's really trying to understand what you want to get out of the platform. If you want top tier enterprise security models and compliance models, go straight to E5, but alternatively, you can start small in terms of the lower SKU numbers and then work your way up into the more higher tier and the more expensive SKU models.
That makes sense. Again, all about that planning in those early few days and weeks, right?
Absolutely.
Brilliant. Okay, well, looking at the time, I can see we've got one last question here, but I'm conscious of time, so we'll come back to that question separately after this event. So thank you for those questions. So with that, I think that's a really good place to wrap up. Again, thank you for everyone who's attended. Hope you found it enjoyable. Hope you found it interesting. Dan, thanks for your time, and for everybody who is on this call, we look forward to welcoming you on our next Camwood Crash Course in the near future. Thanks, and I hope you have a great day. Take care.